What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Forsaken Realms of Vahrin's Call. A fun, sort of silly little RPG, if anything, that takes a lot from Fable, and what it lacks in, I would say, graphical fidelity, it makes up with, honestly, just being fun these days. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked down below as well. In the case of this particular game, I also need to inform you that I received a review key from the developer Titan Rock roughly 2 weeks or so ago, and while I've already made a first impressions video for this because the embargo lifted a while ago, the game itself releases today. Now, as 100% go, this one isn't too bad. It's a relatively small game. The whole thing took me about 25-ish hours, with the thing that required like the most concentrated effort, if you will, being a collectible for these gnomes you can find around and destroy. But the cool thing is, once you kill enough of those guys and you complete the side quest associated with it, you'll actually get an item called the Kickstarter, which, while it is equipped, actually reveals the locations of all the collectibles and everything, which makes everything else a lot easier. And yet, I do also want to give a shout out to their community manager, who pointed me in the right direction on some very specific questions, which allowed me to get the last couple things knocked out, which is why you're seeing this video today and not like a day or two later. But either way, thanks Robin. And now on with the rest of the review. So, as I mentioned, this game is silly. It's got a good bit of humor in there. It's fun to explore and mess around with the various combat options, and while it's not the most beautiful looking game, let's say, I think their stylized realism harkens back to some RPGs like Fable, which it is clearly inspired by. Which is interesting then, because I've seen a lot of the way this game has been marketed about having a like grim, dark fantasy world, and while that's not untrue by any means, it actually does have a wider bit of lore that is a bit depressing at times, and the main story plays it pretty straight. The rest of the game has like a really fun bit of, again, humor and interactions, and the combat on top of that, allowing you to approach it in multiple different ways, even if it's not entirely necessary thanks to the game's difficulty. But you can mess around with traps and throwing potions, cheesing enemies the old-fashioned way, etc. And overall, the gameplay experience for this one is just fun, even if there are some problems, especially around like movement for me personally. But all in all, it was a pretty good experience that I mostly enjoyed, with a few annoyances. Even if it doesn't exactly hit the heights of the best of the genre, you can tell that the people making this cared about it, and I think that goes a long way these days. Now from there, let's kick off with the technical state. Now this one is a little bit interesting because when they first gave me the review key, honestly, it was crashing a good bit, and then over the course of about 2 weeks, they were actively patching it, and it got significantly better. And I wasn't really dealing with any problems at all towards the end of it, and so my hope is that that's how it will be for everybody else on release, but do know there is certainly that possibility in there. For me personally, it seems like they patched all the issues I was having in terms of like crashing and general performance issues. Now, another thing I do kind of want to squeeze in right here is that the movement system in particular can be a little awkward at times, especially around jumping in particular. The game seems to like calculate your momentum, if you will, as you are moving in any given direction, and your jump is kind of based on that, but the exact geometry of the worlds you are messing around with and how sort of fiddly the controls around sprinting can be ultimately means that sometimes it's like weirdly hard to jump when I feel like it shouldn't be, and it gets a little annoying over the course of the entire game. And I needed to mention that in here somewhere, but it's not big enough of a problem to like stop you from playing or anything. Next up, let's talk difficulty for this one. So this is an interesting game to talk about difficulty with because it is not really trying to be a hardcore game by any means. There's a variety of different difficulty settings. On the lowest difficulty, you just straight up can't die. Like, enemies don't seem to be able to kill you. But the catch there is that, well, that might help you get through some bosses or something, if you say have accessibility needs or anything like that. It's also not a game that it matters much if you die, because it'll just kick you back to your last checkpoint with all of your progress saved, so you don't lose anything if you die. Not experience, not collectibles, anything like that. If you've picked it up and then die to a boss or an enemy, or you fall off a ledge or something else, you just get kicked back to the last checkpoint called a soul shrine, and that's pretty much it. So there are difficulty options if you're looking to mess around with exactly how tough individual enemies are, but with, again, how the game is, it's clearly not a game that's trying to be super challenging. So keep that in mind. Next up, when you fire up a new game, we do have a cosmetic character creation. I'll be honest, again, the visuals of this game, outside of like general stylized realism in the environment and everything, is fine. The individual character models are where it probably looks the worst, and so the cosmetic character creation is really not exactly, I would say, a big selling point of this title, but you can make and adjust your character as you please. And if you go into the menus, there's your usual options about like hiding helmet and everything like that in case you actually want to see the character you make over the course of the game. But for me, it's not something I cared too much about. Next up, let's talk story setup and my thoughts on it. So whereas I mentioned the rest of this game is honestly kind of leaning into humor much more than I expected because of the marketing and everything, that's not really the case for the story. The story plays it pretty straight. And within that story, we play the role of a mercenary come to the city of Vahrin looking for employment as a mercenary, of course, to help with the recent troubles here. Not all that long ago, the city of Vahrin was beset by these insect-like pests that they were effectively at war with, and while they ultimately pushed these things back, it came at great cost. Their king died. They're still reeling from the conflict itself, and this has become pretty fertile ground for other problems to pop up within, which is where the mercenary work comes in. In particular, there are bandits everywhere. They've just straight up taken over parts of the town that you'll have to fight off, things like that. And unsurprisingly, as you would probably expect, over the course of the main story, you get kind of roped into some conspiracies and some other goings-on as you choose to ply your trade as a mercenary. Now, overall, I would say the main story is okay. It's not terrible or anything, but it's relatively short, and I think the best bits of this game personally are where it is funny, whether intentionally or not, and so ultimately I don't think people are going to remember this one for the story specifically, but it's hardly the worst thing I've ever seen or anything like that. Next up, let's talk progression systems. So this is where the game gets particularly interesting because the game uses a classless character leveling system, comprised of levels, skills, techniques that you'll learn from those skills, or potentially skill books, and then gear, which has its own progression and upgrades alongside upgrading your magic and your potions, etc. based on your skill level. So there's a good bit of progression to go over. But at a basic level, you will be leveling up to a maximum of 80, it looks like. I got to 80 and I just stopped leveling, so I assume that's the maximum. But outside of your main character level, when you level up, you gain skill points. You can spend those skill points on your skills, but the catch here is that the skills level up individually on their own as you use them. They level up to a maximum of 16, it appears, and while you will unlock skills and techniques to actually apply your points to within these individual bits of like weapon types, magic, etc., some of those are only available by finding skill books. You have to find the skill book, which will then unlock it as a skill, and then provided you have the appropriate skill level, you can also then actually use it. Now you can respec at any time simply by deactivating these, and otherwise it's just the skills you've actually made use of in order to max them out. Your skills themselves are basically your individual actual weapon types, be that dual wielding, sword and board, two-handed weapons, a bow, etc. Then you've got your 4 magic types: fire, ice, earth, and alteration. Each of these has 5 individual spells you can find out and about, letting you play a pure mage if you like. And then the rest of it is basically stuff like your defensive options, your armor, as well as traps and alchemy. Now your magic, provided you've actually found the spells, if you've also got the skills to go with those spells you found, you can then upgrade the magic itself to make it stronger. And if you increase alchemy, you can also then upgrade your potions, essentially combining a bunch of effects based on materials you've found out and about in order to mix a potion that does a bunch of unique stuff. So you'll have some healing potions by default, but you could upgrade those via alchemy to heal you, also restore stamina, which is only really used for blocking, to be honest, or cure different status effects that might get inflicted. There is one status effect called soul burning or something like that that removes your ability to heal, which is annoying, so you might want a potion that cures that. You can also even get a potion that increases your experience gain for a little while if you so choose. So there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with alchemy, but probably the thing I like the most about it is one of the upgrades actually allows you to throw potions as well. So not only can you do a bunch of stuff for yourself, but you can also, via this throw mechanic, inflict debuffs on enemies as well. A similar situation for traps. So there are a bunch of different traps you can pick up and learn how to make, and if you actually invest in the trap skill and learn about them, you can upgrade those traps as well. They have their own little progression path, and so the game really does do a lot to give you a bunch of of different options in that regard. And that's before you even start talking about gear. So gear does have weight, and depending on your armor stat determines how good you are at actually using it, which can affect things like your dodge. And you can upgrade all of this gear and weaponry and stuff you pick up as well, just through regular old forging to make it stronger, though there are very obvious tiers of progression to gear, and so I wouldn't invest too heavily in upgrading individual items unless you are just really locked in on that particular piece of equipment. But that's kind of what we're looking at progression-wise, and so let's move on a little bit to the gameplay and world section. So Vahrin's Call here is made up of a series of interconnected zones or areas to explore. I wouldn't exactly go so far as to call them hubs, as they aren't exactly that big, but if you've played something like the original Fable, I think you would actually get the gist of it here, even if they're a little bigger than that as well. Along these zones, you can also find fast travel points, which are basically little road signs that you can walk up to and then fast travel to places you have been, which is how you can get back and forth between the larger distances. As you move through an area, some places will only become available by progressing the main plot or progressing individual side quests that give you access to just other areas to run around in and explore, but you can always go back to places even after the main story is over. The world remains completely explorable. I don't think anything is truly missable outside of a single achievement, but that is missable right at the very beginning of the game, so it's super easy to start a new playthrough and just get that immediately. So other than that, you can explore as your heart desires, I suppose. And to make that a little easier, your main collectibles, not like everything you can pick up, but the main stuff, which is the treasure chest, the skill books, as well as the gnomes in a given area, will be displayed on the map there. And that's if you want to even bother with some of that before you get the Kickstarter thing from getting all of the gnomes, which will show you where all of them are anyway. Beyond that, the main thing you're going to do is side quests and, of course, fighting the various enemies, which is going to lead you to exploration and various boss fights, etc. Now, the main story part of it is relatively straightforward. You just kind of follow that. That will usually see you moving through the game's various dungeon-like areas that end in a boss. You kill that boss, get sent to the next area, etc. Where the game is at its best is exploration and side quests. In my opinion, this is because the world is actually pretty fun to explore. There's a lot of side quests to find, and they have just littered loot everywhere. And you're going to need that loot to upgrade all your stuff if you want to, which itself has a really good sort of gameplay feedback loop to it. And that, combined with the game's really funny moments, is, again, just where the game is at its best. Just to give a few examples, was a quest where I got blackout drunk and had to fight a bunch of rats that I had been sent down to a basement to kill, old school RPG style. That quest was hilarious. There's a guy who gives you a bunch of hunt quests across the game who is looking for a fearless hunter who can actually take the fight to these ravenous beasts, and unfortunately he can't find one, so he has to settle for you, which was funny. While shaking down a local butcher to pay their debts, you may well uncover some nastiness in terms of what they were actually selling for their meat, and the list goes on. There's just a ton of really humorous moments that I think exploring the world and doing those side quests really puts a good spotlight on, and that is where this game was the most fun for me. But beyond that, it is relatively simple. I do also just want to point out that the game has basically one sort of hub area for you, and that is the South Vale Hamlet. While we are in the city of Vahrin's Call because of all the troubles going on, and you will occasionally meet NPCs in other areas, the South Vale Hamlet is the main area you're actually going to go to do all of your upgrades and just sort of in-town business. So don't expect a lot of settlements to run around and enjoy, just as a heads up. So that then brings us to combat. Combat is an interesting one in this sense because it is, I would say, fun for what it is, but it's also certainly not the best in the genre or anything. A lot of it's a little clunky and weird at times, but thanks to the wide variety of both weapon types, magic, traps, alchemy, you can do some fun stuff with it if you lean into it, because you can decide whether to go, sword and board, which makes it easier to block, of course, or you could go with other one-handed weapons, hammers, axes, etc. You could dual wield if you wanted to. There is a ranged option, which is really easy to cheese some enemies with. There's also magic. So magic requires a bit more of an investment than I wanted to spend on it, but you can do some fun stuff. Fire, ice, and earth magic is pretty much what you would expect, but there's also an alteration bit of magic, which is things like healing, or later on with a quest that is very missable, by the way. You can pick up a spell called Transmogrify and turn enemies into objects effects, that kind of thing. But there's also weapon spells that will add effects to like your weapon, etc. So you can play it as more of like a support battle mage type of role if you please. And then, as I've already outlined, you can also drop traps and throw potions at enemies if you want to lean into that direction as well. And things like the stun trap can make your life a bit easier. But regardless of what route you choose or what weapon you are messing around with, you'll probably want to know about primary and secondary attacks. Primary are basically what you would expect. However, there is a secondary attack, which is usually where your weapon techniques are going to come in. As you advance in a weapon skill, you'll gain access to other techniques, which are effectively combos you can unleash, which can be useful in certain situations. Now, I will say the combat is so relatively straightforward that much like all the other options, you don't need to lean into these, but they're there if you want to. And I did actually find some of the techniques for the ranged weapon in particular pretty helpful, because it has a bleed effect, and it's very possible and relatively easy to use that bleed effect to, say, weaken an enemy and then kind of just run around while it bleeds to death. So there's that. But that's pretty much all I've got to say on combat. Not a terribly complicated system. And then that does in fact bring us to the Steam Deck portion. So the developers of this game are a 7-man team from what I understand. And it's probably because of that they did not do any testing specifically for the Steam Deck, but having played it on that platform for myself, I would say it's probably going to get a rating of playable as is unless it gets some updates. For starters, some of the UI menus, etc. have very, very small text, and Steam is a real stickler about that in particular. And on top of that, while it is playable in terms of how well it runs, the frame rate leaves a bit to be desired, even with the settings pretty much entirely on low. And even then, you're still getting some stuttering and stuff. So if anything, I would say this game is in fact playable there. You can definitely do it, but it's also not the best experience either. Thankfully though, it does have controller support, which is never a given for a smaller game like this, so that's nice to see. But from there, let's move on to positives and negatives and then wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, mainly the sense of humor, the fun I had running around, exploring, just messing around with all the different things, finding different options to complete quests, discovering little hidden areas tucked away, which usually has some form of loot, be that a treasure chest, a skill book, etc. And there's just a really good gameplay feedback loop there of you running around, exploring, having a few laughs, going back to town, upgrading, and getting back out there and doing it again. Nonetheless, there were some negatives. As I mentioned, visually, not the best game in the world, but in particular, the character models look very, very rough at times, noticeably worse than the rest of it, in my opinion, but not exactly a deal breaker for me if you've seen the games I play. I will say, though, the most frustrating thing was really the movement of this game. There is just a sort of oddity to actually, moving around and jumping, and there is a, I would say, almost platforming element to certain areas' exploration, and so it's not like this is easily avoided. But that in particular really did just kind of feel bad compared to playing the rest of it, which was unfortunate. And if I'm being super nitpicky, I also think there's some adjustments on the timing in terms of attacks with two-handed weapons that could be made, or stuff like the movement, again, just generally feeling off and it being hard to turn directions, especially in combat sometimes. And then there are occasional frustrations with trying to aim your cursor at a specific bit of loot that the game just doesn't want to register as something you can pick up, that kind of thing. So a lot of little nitpicks if you want to go down that route, but ultimately that brings me to my conclusion. While Forsaken Realms Vahrin's Call is hardly a pinnacle of the genre or anything, it is honestly, more than anything else, just kind of fun and funny at that, which was plenty enough for me in particular. And so if you want to beat your enemies to death with a frying pan, turn giant yetis into buckets, and then maybe after all that's done, see about this main quest nonsense, then Vahrin's Call might well be up your alley. And at that, it is planning to release for $35 US, which is about where I would put it personally. I would have preferred it be at $30, but that's a nitpick at best, and I am okay for recommending it at that price. So I'm going to give this game a buy. If you do wind up checking it out for yourself, I'd love to hear about it, which of course means to comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.